But to get this show on the road and to start the process of letting you be a bit informed, the first speaker I'd like to call on is my brother Les Malezer, who will explain he will explain the organisation that he works for, or whatever he wants to say. This is my brother Les Malezer from Canberra. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary, and let me jump in early and say thank you very much, Dr. Foley. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the Aboriginal people, the traditional owners of the land in which we gather here tonight, and pay my respects to them for this opportunity to talk about our issues. Also, of course, the very excellent panel that's up here. I've talked with many of the speakers here in the cities and in the territory and so on. And the campaign will always go on for true recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and our rights in Australia. I hope you'll go away from tonight realising that this is the winter solstice, and that's the reason why it's the longest night of the year, not because I spoke too long. And also, well done to the people that are right up the stairs with the seating, and the people who are standing up at the back for coming out tonight and joining with us. Now, I'm going to be very brief because I think that we really need to hear from our sisters in the Northern Territory about what's going on. And I'm presuming that there's an opportunity for people to speak, ask questions at the end of it all. Most of you might be aware that I'm the co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. In a few more weeks it'll be our first 12 months as the elected people on the National Congress, and we've been working very hard from the outset to try and ensure that this is a body that is representative of people, that is not there to make government look good, and that our purpose is to stand up and fight for people's rights. And that brings us back to the situation that we're here to talk about tonight, these laws that apply particularly to the Northern Territory, but also we know that some of these policies are now being applied throughout the other states and territories in Australia as well. And that is what the government is calling the Stronger Futures Bills, what we continue to call the intervention that's imposed upon the peoples in the Northern Territory. Now, from the Congress, we're going to do a particular effort to point out what the rules are here, that there are standards that have to be met. These are standards that we can say they come from the United Nations, they come from human rights treaties and so on, but they also come as being part of people living in Australia, that most Australians understand rights and freedoms. They might not be able to articulate it. They might not know that Australia signed treaties to protect rights and civil and political rights, or economic, social and cultural rights, or rights against discrimination, but most people know and accept that this country is supposedly based upon rights. But as it has done since 1788, this country continues to discriminate, particularly against the First Peoples, and that's a vested interest. It's an interest where if First Peoples were to get equality, the same treatment and the same rights as everybody else living in this country, then something's got to be given up. You know, whether it's lands, whether it's access to resources or benefits from resources, and certain other freedoms and rights that are here. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not a declaration about special rights that a unique class of people have. They're actually rights that everybody in the world enjoys, and they enjoy them collectively through the countries that they live in, the nations that they live in, that sign on to these treaties and so on. They have the right of self-determination. They have the right to free, prior informed consent over any laws that might affect them, their futures. They have the right to determine the futures for their children, etc. They have the right to define their cultures, etc. So these are rights that everybody enjoys, but for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, we cannot enjoy the basic rights that everybody has. And this, as we've discovered in the last few decades, is the same for most of the Indigenous peoples around the world. Their territories have been taken, they're socially and economically marginalised, they have no political voice and no political power, and so on. And that's why there's a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And from my involvement, it's not my mum, it's okay. I heard a giggle there too, that someone heard that. someone else. So where was I? That with the rights that we are expecting as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and the rights that Indigenous peoples around the world are expecting, are just simply equality. They're just simply not to be discriminated against. So we have the right to make our own decisions. We have the right to say whether or not laws are imposed which affect us, that affect our lands, affect our children, affect our education, affect our futures and so on. We have those rights to do that. Somehow in 2007, I think it was on this day, 21st of January 2007, June 21st of June 2007, the federal government legislated away rights of the peoples in the Northern Territory in particular. And that's really, it's not the very first time, the historians will verify on this, but it was a significant message that the Commonwealth, that we fought so hard for in the 1967 referendum, for the Commonwealth had powers to legislate in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, was meant to be a power to benefit Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It was meant to be a power that ensured that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, regardless of which state or territory you lived in, were treated the same, that we weren't treated differently, that we didn't have the right to vote or the right to land or something depending on which side of the border we were on, that all of our rights are equal across the country, and that the federal government had a responsibility to protect that. We thought in 1967 that racial discrimination had been removed from the Constitution, and now we know, of course, that it's not only not removed, but it's actually entrenched. The right to discriminate is actually specifically stated inside the Constitution and is still in there. We don't know if the government's going to go forward to change that or not. Let's keep our fingers crossed on it. And I was brought up, I was born and raised in Queensland, and I was brought up in the Barkly-Peterson regime. And when I started cutting my teeth, when I got into adulthood, that became the focus, to get rid of the black acts in Queensland. And we finally succeeded in doing that in 1984. It took many, many years. It took, for me, something like 12 years of campaigning to do that. So deeply disturbing it was for me when I was in New York in 2007, fighting to get this declaration through in the United Nations, to hear that in Australia on that 21st of June 2007, the Commonwealth had created black acts for the Northern Territory. And that's exactly what they are. Even today, in the bills that are in the Parliament, they are still taking the same approach that the black acts took in Queensland. Save the people from themselves, take away a generation, but wipe off the generation of leadership that's there now, and let's concentrate on the kids coming up, and let's educate them, and let's make sure that they're ready to be like all other Australians, or equal to all other Australians, and so on. The same thing is happening now, and there's no better way to describe it. There's no other way to describe it, just simply that a few people, a few unaccountable people, people who won't make themselves known, people who won't enter into a debate with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about what laws should be in place and how those laws should benefit. Let me now move to finish up by saying in the Congress we're taking a position on the standards. The message you probably have heard us saying is that we want the Parliament to scrutinise these stronger future bills to see how they comply with the human rights treaties that Australia has signed. These are legally binding treaties. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm talking in particular about the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. There are other treaties that have relevance as well, but those three treaties alone would nullify, or would mean that Australia should not be passing these particular laws. So we're using the commitment that was made by this government. They made it before the last elections, so therefore they have an obligation in this term of government to meet that commitment. And that was that all legislation going before the Parliament would have a compliance certificate issued to say how this legislation complied with the human rights treaties. The Minister has not issued a compliance certificate. We have written now to the chair of this new parliamentary committee, joint committee on scrutiny of human rights, and told them that they must subject these bills to scrutiny. The government has tried to use the argument that because the stronger future bills were tabled in the Parliament before the new human rights scrutiny bills were tabled 2 or 3 days before, that these bills are not subject to it. But our submission that's gone to the Parliament, to the Joint Parliamentary Committee, points out that it's not only bills going before the Parliament that have to be scrutinised, it's also existing legislation. And we point out that it's therefore the will of the Parliament. To us it is clear it's the will of the Parliament, whether these are bills or whether it was tabled before or after these other bills in the Parliament, they should be scrutinised. They must be scrutinised because that was the will of the Parliament. And that's the message that we're currently campaigning with as a Congress on this. My last words, a discussion I've already had with Barbara, is that as Congress, we're going to look for the standards. We're going to maintain, we're going to call the standards. We're going to make sure that people know in the Parliament, in the public, in our community, know what the standards are. But we won't necessarily be carrying out all the political campaigning. We think the obligation is upon the people of Australia, upon the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to do the campaigning. We'll point out what the issues are, what the standards are. We'll show what equality is and what racial discrimination is and so on, but it's up to people then to motivate and to do something about it. The biggest question still resting in Australia is still the First Peoples. Every government can immediately put it on the back burner or make an apology or do a ceremony and then put it away and so on. The biggest question for every government in Australia now and into the future is always going to be the settlement with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to recognise and respect the rights of the First Peoples. Thank you very much.